All right, let's take a look at this first set of writers here. Now, some of these writers are going to be important writers, some of them are less known writers. Here's a representation of some of them. Please remember to always look in more depth of these writers and take a look at, what I present here, which is not complete, it's partial. It's really hard to get in all the writers on the test as the test varies. So please, take a look at the reading, supplement it, and do additional research on your own. So the first writer we're going to look at here is Joseph Kirkland. He was the literary editor for the Chicago Tribune. And this is interesting because a lot of the writers of the era were also connected to newspapers. They were reporters, they were editors, and we'll see a lot of this happening as we move along. So he fought in the Civil War, worked as a lawyer, and as a businessman. His most famous work here is Zuri, the Meanest Man in Spring County. And I just pointed this novel out as a quick starter here because you could see he talks about the pioneer life in the West. And it's about a tough man married to a strong, respected woman, and it's written in Hoosier dialect. So this is a little close, start off here with a regionalist writer here, writing about this particular area, and in a dialect there, which was another characteristic of the realism. So what we're going to do here now is take a look at Rebecca Harding Davis. Very important writer, did a lot of writing, was discovered later on. Her work was inspired by the Industrial Revolution. And it's very interesting because she has a lot of different things that she exposes with that. She's considered one of the country's first social historians. And why is that? Because she pointed out a lot of the conditions in the industrial labor, a lot of the conditions that the workers were exposed to. And this is important for realism because it's not just a subjective, I think this is happening, I think that. As we see with realism, it's really trying to take a look at and point out what's going on with detail. So we see this detail in the dialogue, we see this detail in the description, and that's important for this development. So she published a lot in her life, but she was forgotten, rediscovered in '72. Now she's considered an important feminist writer because of the protagonists in her work. So this Life in the Iron Mills is something to particularly look at. So this is a novella. A novella is I think I mentioned before, it's longer than a short story, but shorter than a novel. So this is a novella about factory labor and women's issues. And it was originally published in the Atlantic Monthly, one of the first realist works, like I said. But it's very interesting because, if you've done some research on this, or you've read some of the stuff, or if you've lived in the Northeast, you could see a lot of the Lowell, Massachusetts, some parts of Connecticut. They're factory towns, and a lot of these large buildings have been converted into artist studios or apartments or antique places, and it's interesting to see where a lot of this came from. So here's an example of the original piece here. As it was published. And moving on here to talk about what is it about? It exposes the avarice of capitalism of the Industrial Revolution, talking about classes. Up here, the capitalists are exposing they're exploiting the workers down here. So we've got the class going on here. Very naturalistic style because it portrays, we've got gender, we've got ethnic and class struggles. And this is important here because it's not just talking about women's issues, but it's talking about ethnic issues and class struggles. So it's got a lot in one package. The wage workers were unable to move beyond their circumstances of their factory life. And this is one of the characteristics we pointed out about naturalism. So there's a narrator, and she asks you not to pass judgment on the characters in the story because that's part of the non-intervention policy that we have here with realism, where it's just a observation and to take a look at the way it is. So in the story, Deborah and Hugh Wolfe, Hugh doesn't think that he belongs in the iron mill as a worker. He thinks he should have a better job. It's a lot of but that's the way it is. That's the condition. Explicit dialogue of the injustices of the working condition, the detail that explains and describes the situation there. Here we've got Deborah. She's tired and hunchback. She basically steals a wallet, gives it to Hugh. Hugh says, I'm going to keep this. We're going to keep this because I think we deserve it. But they end up getting caught. They get put in jail. He ends up, after losing his mental stability, he takes his own life. And it just, you know, the ending of that is not as positive as a lot of the other stuff that we're going to see or have seen. But that's the way it is. Contrast of classes, contrast of living conditions, misery and helplessness, as people feel that they can't get out of the confines of destitution and poverty. And this is a lot of exposing a lot of the ills there. So at the end of the story, there's a Quaker woman that intervenes, but she is a little bit too late to really have a large impact on what's going on. Okay, so let's take a look here at Horatio Alger. Now he's a very popular writer of the time, from the rags to riches story. He has the same stock characters in all of them, okay? Now, this name here, Ragged Dick, you might want to remember because it's his most popular novel, and out of all the novels he wrote, this one stood out. Here's a picture here of the way some of his characters would look in his stories, and talking a bit about that. It's kind of written on the subgenre of the Bildungsroman. It's a German word, a coming-of-age novel where a young character undergoes education through, you know, process of serendipitous events. And you could see here how this is different from what I described before about the intervention of serendipity. So these novels are a bit different in that sense. I'll get back to that in a sec, but talking about some of his other novels, he's got some of his later works are more darker and you know, not as positivist, because he was catering to a more sensationalist market. So he wrote about 100 novels in his life. What a number, huh? What do you write, 40 or 50 years? Imagine that. What was that, 2-3 novels a year? That's a lot of writing. Some writers have written more, some less, but still, that's an incredible feat there. So once again, talking about the prototype of this type of person. It's a young lad who falls upon chance to help a rich gentleman, who in turn helps him out. And through a series of events, you know, in antagonists and stuff, the young lad obviously is the virtuous character, and the young man rises in society and becomes successful. So that, yes, this is a different ending from the typical realist novel, but yet it still does deal with class, and that's an important part here in the realist era. And here we get to Mark Twain. Essential reading across the board. I'm sure that you've read this in high school. Maybe you haven't, but I did. And you know, it's fun reading. It's a fun read to find out, you know, the adventures of what happened to these young boys, and you know, a lot of the circumstances in life that they had to figure out and weave their way through. So Mark Twain had a different name, but he got his pen name from steamboat jargon because he worked on steamboats himself when he was younger, and this had a big influence on what he wrote, and you know, where he wrote and what he wrote about. So his two most famous works, as you may know, are The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And you can see here there's about 9-year difference between them there. So here's a stamp here with Mark Twain. A lot of the stamps commemorative of the time would have famous writers on them. So his work addresses the social ills and class differences, criticizes slavery and social inequalities. And this is important because if you read the novel, I mean, I read the novel when I was 14 or 15, maybe 16, I don't remember. But you know, you just read it and you're like, hey, that's a good read, or this isn't a good read, or whatever. But you just read the story. But underneath that, this is what's going on. You've got a lot of the criticisms of slavery, a lot of the discussion of the class differences, and that brings in the realist perspective for us to look at. So even though he's not, although he's seen as a major regionalist writer, and you can see this with Huck and Tom, where you know he's written about the South here, and you know, even though it seems like that's his main style of writing, he wrote about different topics in different geographical areas. And just to give you an example of that, he wrote Innocents Abroad about when he was in Europe. He wrote Roughing It about his travels to the West. He wrote A Prince and the Pauper, and he wrote A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, just to name a few. So we've got different spaces, places, and times here. Spaces and places would be the same, I guess, but at different times and spaces in general about different things that he would write about. So that's to show you that it's not just a Southern writer there, although that's what he's most known for. Now, back to Tom Sawyer. So this is a picaresque novel. We're going to see this word a couple more times, but when you think about picaresque, you can what's Tom Sawyer like? Just his character is picaresque. Dennis the Menace type person that, is able to get things done, thinks cunningly. Usually, a young fellow that has to, lower class, that has to work through his way through society, his way through life, to deal with things and learn about what's going on through a series of events and skills, and we'll see this with other people in general. In this novel, we've got Tom lives with Aunt Polly, tells him one day to paint a fence. And here we've got a picture of that famous first scene there. As we move on, I'm just going to explain the plot a little bit here to refresh your memory, or tell you about it if you haven't read it. With his cunning tactics, he tricks friends into helping him. That's part of the picaresque style there. Becky's a schoolgirl he likes that doesn't go far at the beginning. He goes with Huck to a graveyard and they witness Injun Joe doing something that he shouldn't be doing. Because of this, they run away and the town thinks that they're no longer alive. Tom sneaks back and witnesses his own funeral. This is interesting. This is one of the parts that I remember, that whole idea of objective realism, the observation. He's observing his own funeral. And it's interesting to see that element of observation, of a character observing something about himself. So back into society and alive again, Tom takes the fall for something Becky did and gets on her good side. And then with in court they testify against Injun Joe, who escapes captivity and takes off. So when Tom and Huck are out on one of their adventures, because the whole thing really is about their adventures, stuff that they stumble upon or come across, they find Injun Joe who has a treasure that he's looking to bury. So Tom splits from Huck and goes with Becky to McDougall's cave, where they get lost. And this is where the action picks up, because Huck reveals Injun Joe's scheme against Widow Douglas. Injun Joe escapes again to hide in McDougall's cave, where Tom and Becky are at this time, but they're able to escape. So at the end, they in turn report on Injun Joe's whereabouts, and the town takes action. They discover where the gold was hidden, and they get a financial reward for it. So the ending here, you could see, it's a complete story with its layout of, presentation, development, climax, and the denouement here at the end. Following that, we've got Huck Finn, so kind of essentially a sequel to Tom Sawyer 9 years later. Huck Finn now lives with Widow Douglas to avoid his father. He gets bored, runs away from home, and meets an escaped slave named Jim. And here we've got a picture of that, that scene there. So the two of them are involved in a number of adventures with people along the way. Huck learns about prejudice in society and the evils of racism and slavery. So we see how this one enters in a more direct way in the social ills of the time than Tom Sawyer, and explicit observations, explicit learning process here about Huck. So Jim teaches him many valuable lessons, and in the end, Huck returns home. So then at the end he has to take off again and go out west because it's the adventures of. But this is very the regionalist novel written in dialogue to imitate people's speech at the time. And like I said, it's got themes of racism, but the idea of identity, what's Huck about, what is moral, what is not moral, and this has to do with that objectivity and the idea about what's important in society. So there's a lot of mixed responses from critics, like some of Jim's characters, overall racist tones. You've got many different types of people that are characterized. The Duke and the Dauphin, for example, families in unrest, robbers, bounty hunters, a lot of different secondary characters mixed in here. A lot of these characters you should try to remember who they are because they're important figures in American literature. Let's take a look here at William Dean Howells. This is an interesting particular piece here because he wrote Editha here in 1905, but check out this contrast. It's about a woman that romanticizes war and pushes her anti-war fiancé to enlist, which he does, and for which he's killed in battle. So we've got the idea of the romanticization of war. But then you've got the ending there where he's, the realist depiction there at the end of, it's not about romanticism. It's not going to have a positive outcome. And in the end, he's killed in battle, and you get this realist depiction at the end of all that. Here's a picture of him here. as you can see. Moving along, he also wrote novels such as The Rise of Silas La Femme and A Traveler from Altrulia. So one thing about him that's important also is he's best known for his literary acquaintances with Thoreau, Emerson, Hawthorne, Whitman, Wharton, and Crane, and once again for being involved in a newspaper here with the Atlantic Monthly. And another interesting thing about him was he was appointed by Lincoln to be a consul in Italy. So those are some of the writers in this first section. Please remember to supplement this with further research and to take a look at the text that we've suggested.